The ship does not anchor immediately. John White stands at the rail, staring at the shoreline he has replayed in his mind for 3 years. He expects smoke, movement, anything. Instead, Roanoke Island sits silent beneath a heavy sky. When he steps onto the sand, even the wind seems restrained. The houses still stand. That is the first wrongness. They are not burned. They are not torn down in chaos. They are carefully dismantled, boards removed, beams taken, nails salvaged. The colony did not fall. It relocated. White walks toward the wooden post near the fort's entrance. He already knows what he will see, but he prays for something else. Carved deeply into the wood, CROATOAN. He searches frantically for the second mark they had agreed upon, a cross carved if they left under threat. There is none. No cross, no graves, no bodies. The relief should overwhelm him. Instead, dread settles in his chest. They did not die here. They made a decision without him. And that may be worse. Roanoke was not born from confidence. It was born from rivalry. England in 1587 was not the master of the seas. Spain was. Spanish treasure fleets crossed the Atlantic heavy with gold and silver, and every coin strengthened England's greatest enemy. The New World was not simply opportunity, it was leverage. Roanoke was supposed to be a foothold, but by the time the settlers arrived, it was already compromised ground. The first English attempt years earlier had collapsed. Relationships with local tribes had been strained, sometimes violently, by earlier expeditions. Promises had been broken, blood had been spilled, and yet they came again. Not with soldiers hardened for conquest, with families, carpenters, brickmakers, farmers, women carrying infants, men carrying tools instead of armor. They stepped onto the island believing in permanence, but permanence requires preparation. And Roanoke was underfunded from the beginning. Sir Walter Raleigh needed results, but England's attention was divided. Resources were stretched thin. War with Spain loomed. The colony was given just enough support to attempt survival, not enough to guarantee it. Eleanor Dare sensed the fragility immediately. The land was beautiful, yes. Tall grasses bending in salt wind, dense forests promising timber and game. But beauty can conceal hostility. The soil was unfamiliar, the climate unpredictable, and the English were strangers tolerated by neighboring tribes, not welcomed by them. When Virginia Dare was born that August, the settlement gathered as if history had already chosen them. The first English child born in the New World. They baptized her with pride. They toasted to permanence, but beneath the celebration lingered a quiet truth no one wanted to name. They were alone. And alone in a land still deciding whether to accept them is a dangerous way to begin an empire. Hunger does not arrive loudly. It creeps. At first, it is inconvenience. Smaller portions, rationed grain, longer hunting trips that return with little to show. The settlers reassure one another that the next harvest will be stronger. That trade will improve. That white will return before winter deepens. But optimism thins as quickly as their stores. The soil refuses to cooperate with English expectations. Farming methods that worked in Europe fail in coastal Carolina. Crops sprout unevenly. Storms flatten what little grows. The forest yields game inconsistently, as if it too is uncertain whether to sustain them. Trade with neighboring tribes becomes strained. The CROATOAN remain friendly, but others are wary, and wariness is contagious. Every exchange now carries tension beneath courtesy. The English need more than they can offer in return. Dependence begins to hum beneath daily life. Inside the settlement, frustration turns inward. Meetings stretch late into the night. Voices rise, accusations sharpen. Why did Raleigh send so few supplies? Why did they settle here instead of the Chesapeake as originally planned? Why are we waiting for England to save us? Some blame leadership. Some blame fate. Some whisper that God has turned his face from them. Eleanor watches the change in people more than the change in land. Men who once spoke confidently now measure every bite. Mothers count dwindling provisions in silence. Laughter becomes rare. Conversations stop when someone approaches. Fear fractures communities faster than famine. And beneath every argument lies the unspoken terror. What if England does not come? When the proposal arises that John White must return for supplies, the debate is vicious. White resists, not as governor, but as father. Leaving means abandoning his daughter and infant granddaughter to uncertainty. But Eleanor understands what pride cannot fix. If you stay, she tells him quietly, we all starve. The truth lands heavier than any accusation. Before he boards the ship, they make their agreement. Carved words if they relocate, a cross if forced. It feels orderly, rational. But hunger has already begun unraveling something far more fragile than food supplies. Trust. When John White's ship vanished beyond the horizon, the colony did not panic. Not at first. They told themselves it would be months, a season perhaps. England would send supplies. White would return with grain, tools, reinforcements. The system still existed. The empire still functioned. But the ocean has a way of swallowing certainty. Weeks passed, then months. Winter came hard and damp, seeping into wood and bone. Food stores shrank with visible cruelty. Rations were measured carefully, then cut again. Hunting parties returned empty-handed more often than not. The forest, once full of promise, now felt watchful. And still no sails appeared on the horizon. Hope is loud in the beginning. It speaks confidently. It makes plans. But when hope begins to fail, it does not announce its departure. It leaves quietly and leaves something darker in its place. Suspicion. Conversations shortened, doors closed more often, small disagreements sharpened into personal grievances. Who had taken extra grain? Who had traded too generously with the CROATOAN? Who had angered neighboring tribes? No one had proof of betrayal. But fear does not require proof. It requires vulnerability. The settlers had built their lives around the assumption that England would come back for them. As that assumption weakened, so did their sense of identity. Were they still an English outpost, or something forgotten? Eleanor Dare felt the shift most acutely. Virginia was growing, watching, learning the mood of adults before understanding the words. Eleanor could see it in the child's eyes, confusion at the tension that filled every room. At night, wind battered the settlement walls. In the darkness, imagination grew teeth. Every snapped branch in the forest sounded like threat. Every distant movement felt deliberate. And beneath it all lay a more terrifying question than starvation. What if White is not delayed? What if England has chosen not to return? Isolation does not simply weaken the body, it destabilizes reality. The colonists began to argue not just about food, but about direction. Some demanded they fortify and prepare for violence. Others insisted that staying put was slow suicide. The old hierarchy began to erode. Leadership without supply is only suggestion. For the first time, the unthinkable was spoken aloud. We are alone. And once that sentence is accepted, everything changes. Because survival without rescue requires a different kind of courage. Not pride, not conquest, but surrender to the land and to those who already belong to it. And for some in Roanoke, that surrender felt worse than death. The meeting did not begin as rebellion. It began as exhaustion. They gathered inside the largest remaining structure near the fort, lantern light flickering against timber walls, already beginning to warp from coastal damp. Faces were thinner now, eyes hollowed not just by hunger, but by uncertainty. There was no formal call to order, no governor to preside. John White had been authority, and John White was gone. That absence hung heavier than the winter air. At first, the conversation circled familiar ground, food stores, trade prospects, hunting routes. But these were surface-level discussions, rehearsed and repeated for months. Everyone knew why they were truly there. The question was no longer how to endure. It was whether to remain. One of the older settlers spoke first. We fortify. We make this place defensible. If we show strength, we survive. It was a comforting idea. Strength meant identity. Walls meant control. But another voice cut in, sharper. Against whom? Silence followed. They were not soldiers. They had no reinforcements coming. Powder was limited, weapons few, and even if an attack never came, starvation would. Then someone spoke the word that had been hovering over them for weeks. CROATOAN. The tribe to the south had been consistent in trade, respectful, even protective at times. But relocating there meant more than moving homes. It meant acknowledging that Roanoke had failed. It meant abandoning the illusion that this was English land. Voices rose quickly. If we go to them, we live under their rule. Better under their rule than under the ground. And what becomes of our children? The question lingered. It was not about food anymore. It was about identity. To move meant adapting, perhaps permanently, learning language, accepting customs, intermarriage even, the blending of boundaries that England would never approve of. Some men refused outright. I will not bend the knee in a land meant for English dominion. But dominion had not materialized, and Eleanor Dare finally spoke. Her voice was steady, dangerously steady. This land does not care what we believe it was meant to be. The room quieted. She did not speak as White's daughter. She spoke as a mother. Our children are thinner. Our supplies are gone. We are not debating pride. We are debating survival. No one answered immediately because she had named the truth. This was not a council of expansion. It was a council of surrender. And surrender is hardest for those who have built their identity on control. Another colonist, quieter than the rest, added what no one wanted to say aloud. If White returns and finds us gone? The weight of that question pressed into the floorboards. To leave meant possibly never reuniting with him. To stay meant risking that there would be no one left to reunite with. The decision did not come with raised hands. It came slowly, like frost spreading across glass. One by one, resistance softened. Not because pride disappeared, but because hunger had already broken it. By the time the lantern burned low, Roanoke had made its choice. They would dismantle the settlement, take what they could carry, leave no chaos behind. They would carve the agreed word into the wood, not as a cry for help, as a message. We moved. And in that decision, quiet, practical, devastating, Roanoke ceased to be an English colony. It became something else, not lost, but no longer what it was meant to be. They did not arrive at CROATOAN as equals. They arrived as people who had run out of options. The walk south had taken days. Children carried when they could no longer keep pace. Tools strapped across backs. Timber salvaged from homes they might never see again. No one spoke much during that journey. Looking forward was easier than looking back. The CROATOAN would have seen them coming long before they entered the village boundary. 100 English settlers, thinner, slower, quieter than when they first arrived years earlier. There is a difference between alliance and absorption. Alliance allows distance. Absorption demands surrender. The CROATOAN had been friendly traders, but hospitality does not mean naivety. They remembered earlier English aggression from other expeditions. They knew the settlers were weakened. Weakness shifts power. There would have been negotiation, terms unrecorded by history. You may stay, but you contribute. You may eat, but you learn. You may survive, but you do not rule. The English brought value, metal tools, craftsmanship, knowledge of certain farming techniques. These were assets, but they were no longer bargaining from strength. For some settlers, this shift was humiliating. Men who once believed they were planting the seeds of empire now found themselves asking permission to harvest. Pride does not dissolve quickly. It curdles. Some resisted quietly, clung to English customs, refused to adopt new clothing or methods, insisted on maintaining separate identity within the village. But isolation inside refuge is fragile. Food was shared, labor was shared, defense was shared. Children crossed boundaries first. Virginia Dare would have grown hearing 2 languages in a single day, playing alongside CROATOAN children, learning which plants healed and which poisoned, learning the land not as a conqueror's prize, but as a living system. Children adapt without ideology. Adults do not. Eleanor likely understood the cost more clearly than most. Every time her daughter answered in a language other than English, something tightened in her chest. Every time tribal customs replaced familiar ones, she felt distance from the world she once knew. But Virginia was alive, and alive was the only measure that mattered. Over time, blending became less noticeable. English clothing wore out, and was replaced with garments better suited to the climate. Diets changed, accents softened. Intermarriage was not sudden, but it was inevitable in proximity. Some colonists may have moved inland with allied groups. Some may have formed hybrid households. The original settlement structure dissolved into scattered threads. Roanoke did not vanish in a single moment. It thinned, like ink in water. And somewhere in those years, the colony crossed a threshold. There is no longer a point at which it could reassemble itself as purely English. If White had arrived then, if he had stepped into CROATOAN village and called for his daughter, what would he have seen? A settlement no longer his. A granddaughter who spoke differently. A people who survived by changing. That is the part history resists. Massacre is clean. Assimilation is complicated, but survival often demands the kind of surrender empires cannot admit. Roanoke did not fall. It adapted. An adaptation to those who left England believing in permanence may have felt like a kind of death. 3 years is long enough for hope to decay. By the time John White secured passage back to Roanoke in 1590, he was no longer the same man who had left. England had nearly been invaded. The Spanish Armada had consumed ships, men, attention. Every delay had carved something out of him. First confidence, then authority, then certainty. What remained was obligation. When his ship finally reached the Carolina coast, White did not celebrate. He watched the shoreline in silence. He knew too much about how fragile settlements could be. When he stepped onto Roanoke Island and found it empty, relief and dread arrived together. The carving was exactly what they had agreed upon. CROATOAN, no cross, no sign of violence. They had moved willingly. He read the letters over and over as if repetition would produce direction. CROATOAN Island lay only miles south, close enough to feel reachable, close enough to promise answers. White ordered the ship prepared to sail immediately, but the sea does not answer to human urgency. A storm gathered with unnatural speed. Wind howled through rigging, waves turned violent, anchors strained. The crew, already uneasy after months at sea, refused to risk running aground in unfamiliar shallows during a gale. White argued. He pleaded. He demanded. But command without leverage is only noise. The storm worsened. For days the ship was battered, forced northward, away from the coastline. White stood on deck through rain and salt spray, staring into gray distance, as if he could will the land closer. Somewhere beyond that horizon, possibly alive, were his daughter and granddaughter. Close enough to touch, and unreachable. The storm did not last forever. But the crew's patience did. Supplies were limited. The season was turning. Morale was thin. Investors back in England expected a return, not a reckless gamble. The captain made the decision. They would not attempt CROATOAN. They would return to England. White had no authority left to countermand it. In that moment, standing on the deck as the coastline faded again, he experienced a second abandonment. The first had been forced by war. This one was forced by weather and human caution. History rarely hinges on dramatic battles. Sometimes it hinges on wind direction. White returned to England and never came back. He never saw CROATOAN, never confirmed whether his family had survived those 3 years, never knew if Virginia Dare grew to adulthood, never knew whether the blending had already taken root. He died with absence instead of answers. And because he never reached CROATOAN, the story remained unfinished. Had he stepped ashore there, history might have recorded transformation. Instead, it recorded mystery. Later, English settlers whispered of tribes with unusual features, gray eyes, lighter hair. Stories of ancestors who could read from books. European artifacts appearing inland. Fragments. Possibilities. But nothing definitive. The storm had erased the final link, and in doing so, it preserved the legend. Roanoke did not need violence to become myth. It only needed distance. White came within miles of the truth. Miles. But history is merciless with distance, and sometimes being almost there is more haunting than never arriving at all. By the time Jamestown was founded in 1607, Roanoke was already fading into rumor. 20 years had passed. The English crown was no longer experimenting cautiously. It was committing to colonization with sharper intent. Investors demanded profit. The Virginia Company demanded land, labor, and legitimacy. And legitimacy requires narrative. Jamestown's early years were brutal. Disease, starvation, internal power struggles, fragile relations with the Powhatan Confederacy. The colony nearly collapsed more than once. Supplies ran thin. Morale was fragile. Confidence in overseas ventures was easily shaken. Roanoke lingered in memory like a warning. But the interpretation of that warning mattered. If Roanoke had been massacred, the lesson was clear. The New World was dangerous. Indigenous tribes were threats. Military strength was necessary. Fortification was justified. If Roanoke had assimilated, willingly blended into native communities, the lesson was far more dangerous to empire. It suggested English identity was permeable. It suggested survival required compromise, not dominance. It suggested that the so-called civilized could be changed by the land and its people. For a rising colonial power, that implication was unacceptable. Empire depends on hierarchy. On clear lines between ruler and ruled, assimilation blurs those lines. So, Roanoke became a ghost story. The lost colony. Not the adapted colony. Not the colony that survived differently. Notice what did not happen in official records. There was no aggressive follow-up investigation into CROATOAN beyond White's failed attempt. No sustained search missions funded by the Crown. No organized retrieval effort once Jamestown was stable enough to look south seriously. Why? Because by then, Roanoke's ambiguity had value. A vanished colony reinforced urgency. It justified stronger military presence. It justified hardened attitudes toward indigenous groups. It supported a narrative that the wilderness swallowed the weak, and only strength could prevail. A story of peaceful merging would have undermined that message. It would have suggested that the English needed native alliances not as temporary trade partners, but as long-term equals. That kind of story does not attract investors. It does not inspire dominance. And so, the silence remained convenient, even as whispers persisted. Jamestown settlers reported rumors of tribes inland who claimed ancestors from across the sea. Accounts of individuals with gray or light-colored eyes, stories of people who possessed European tools generations before sustained trade would explain them. These reports were never fully pursued. They were noted, then folded quietly into the margins, because ambiguity was safer than confirmation. Over time, Roanoke transformed from unresolved event into folklore. The Dare Stones appeared centuries later, claiming to recount Eleanor's death and hardship. Most were dismissed as hoaxes, and perhaps they were. But their popularity revealed something telling. The public preferred tragedy. Massacre provides closure. Absorption does not. Absorption forces uncomfortable questions. If the colonists survived by integrating into indigenous society, then who truly adapted to whom? Who was stronger? Who shaped the future? Colonial mythology requires clarity. Heroes, victims, villains. Roanoke offered none of those cleanly. So the narrative hardened into mystery. And mystery is easier to control than truth, because mystery can be shaped by whoever tells it. In the decades that followed, English colonization accelerated. Conflicts with native tribes intensified, policies hardened, land seizures increased. And Roanoke, the experiment that may have chosen coexistence, was reduced to a cautionary tale. It is possible that no conspiracy silenced the truth. It may have been simpler than that. Human nature favors stories that affirm power, and stories that complicate power are allowed to fade. If Roanoke had been rediscovered living peacefully among the CROATOAN, what would that have meant for Jamestown's model? What would it have meant for English superiority? What would it have meant for the idea that the New World required domination rather than adaptation? Sometimes history does not need to be rewritten. It only needs to be left unfinished. Roanoke was not erased. It was allowed to become unclear. And in that uncertainty, empire found what it needed: a legend, a warning, a justification. But perhaps history, not the truth, likes ruins. It likes bones. It likes clean endings, preferably dramatic ones. Roanoke offered none of those. No mass grave, no battlefield, no final letter written in desperation. Just a word carved into wood. CROATOAN, and then silence. For centuries, that silence has been treated like a scream. The lost colony. The first great American mystery. A warning about the dangers of the New World. But what if it was never meant to be a warning? What if it was simply the story of a group of people who reached the edge of their certainty and chose to survive differently? Because when you strip away myth, the pieces form a pattern. They dismantled their homes carefully. They carved a planned destination. They left no sign of violence. Later settlers heard rumors of blended communities. Archaeology has found English artifacts on Hatteras Island, not proof of massacre, but of movement. Nothing explosive, nothing theatrical. Just fragments. And fragments are uncomfortable. They force imagination to fill the gaps. So imagine this: Virginia Dare does not die in infancy. She grows. She learns 2 languages. She understands English hymns and CROATOAN rituals. She knows the ocean tides and the forest paths. She does not think of herself as lost. She thinks of herself as belonging. But belonging does not fit neatly into imperial storytelling. England needed permanence, dominion, hierarchy. Roanoke may have quietly demonstrated something far more radical, that survival in the New World did not belong to the strongest. It belonged to the adaptable. And adaptation threatens power structures. Because adaptation means change. It means surrendering the illusion that one culture can remain untouched in a new land. If Roanoke survived through assimilation, then the first English colony in America did not establish dominance. It blended. It yielded. It became something neither fully English nor fully native. That is not a failure of survival, but it is a failure of empire. And empires rarely celebrate those. John White died without answers. That is the human tragedy. A father who never knew. A grandfather who never saw what became of the first English child born in America. But perhaps the larger tragedy is how quickly the story hardened into something simpler than it likely was. We prefer them dead. It is easier. Dead settlers reinforce danger. Danger justifies conquest. But settlers who survive by joining indigenous communities suggest something more complicated. They suggest coexistence. They suggest humility. They suggest that English identity was not inevitable on that shore. Roanoke did not need a massacre to disappear. It only needed time. Time for accents to shift, for marriages to blend bloodlines, for children to forget which lullaby came from which shore. Within 2 generations, Roanoke would no longer exist as a separate memory. It would exist in faces, in stories, in small genetic traces carried forward quietly, not lost, absorbed. And absorption is harder to memorialize than destruction. Today, tourists stand on Roanoke Island and look for ghosts. They search for drama, for some violent end that makes sense of the mystery. But perhaps the ghost is simpler. Perhaps the ghost is the idea that identity is fragile, that empire is not destiny, that sometimes the first English foothold in America did not conquer. It surrendered to survive. The word carved into that post was not a cry. It was direction. White came within miles of finding the truth. Storms stopped him. And storms have been shaping this story ever since. Roanoke remains unsolved, not because the evidence is dramatic, but because the evidence is subtle. And subtle truths do not command headlines. They linger, they whisper, they ask uncomfortable questions. What if the first English colony did not disappear into the wilderness? What if it chose to become part of it? That possibility does not offer spectacle. It offers reflection, and reflection is quieter. Roanoke is not terrifying because it vanished. It is unsettling because it may have adapted, and adaptation changes everything.